10 years after I buried my husband, his bank called to ask why a forgotten account in his name had just received a wire transfer of $47 million. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Eleanor Winslow. Most people who know me call me Nora, a nickname my husband gave me on our second date, and that simply stuck, the way certain names do when they're said with enough tenderness. For 34 years, that name belonged to a woman who believed she understood the shape of her own life completely. I live in a narrow clapboard house on Live Oak Lane in Savannah, Georgia, the kind of street where Spanish moss hangs low over the sidewalks and the afternoons move slower than anywhere else in the world. Thomas and I bought that house in 1985, the year after our wedding, and I never once imagined leaving it. Thomas worked, or so he always told me, as a marine parts distributor, supplying hardware to the shrimping boats and pleasure craft that filled the Savannah River docks. He wore the same weathered ball cap for a decade, drove a pickup truck with a rusted wheel well, and came home most evenings smelling of diesel and brine. He told me early in our marriage that the business was steady but never generous, that a distributor's margins were thin and unpredictable, and that we should live carefully. I believed him completely. I was 26 years old, freshly hired as a piano teacher at a small private academy, and I had no reason in the world to doubt the man I loved. We were not an unhappy couple. I want to say that clearly, because everything that came afterward could tempt a person to rewrite the good years into something they never were. There were real mornings of contentment between us. Coffee on the porch while the fog burned off the marsh, Sunday drives out to Tybee Island, Christmas mornings that smelled of cinnamon and cedar. Thomas was a quiet man, careful with his words, the sort of person who kept his private thoughts folded away like letters no one else was meant to read. I assumed that was simply who he was. I assumed I knew the whole of him. He died on a Thursday in September, 10 years ago this month. A sudden cardiac event while he was out on the water alone, checking a mooring line for a client, the coroner said. By the time the harbor patrol reached his boat, there was nothing left to do. He was 54 years old. I remember very little about the days that followed except that grief, in its earliest form, is mostly paperwork. There were calls to make, forms to sign, casseroles to accept from neighbors whose names I only half remembered. Thomas's half-brother Marcus flew down from Charleston with his wife Renee, and they sat in my kitchen holding my hands and telling me, over and over, that I only had to ask if I needed anything. I took their kindness at face value then. I have since learned to examine kindness more carefully. I spent the first year mostly underwater myself, moving through the motions of a life that no longer had its center. I kept teaching piano because the children needed me and because, honestly, I needed them more. I sold Thomas's truck. I gave his tools to a young man from church who was trying to start his own boat repair shop. I closed our joint checking account and opened a simpler one in my name alone, and slowly, the way grief eventually does, the sharp edges of loss softened into something I could carry without collapsing under it. I told myself, as the years passed, that I had learned everything there was to learn about my husband's life, and that whatever secrets a marriage sometimes hides, ours had held none worth uncovering. I was wrong about that, though it would take a decade for me to understand exactly how wrong. The years in between were not empty ones, and I want to be honest about that too, because a story like this can make a decade sound like a held breath, a pause between one shock and the next, when in truth it was simply a life, lived the way lives are lived after loss. Peter finished college 2 years after his father died and moved to Atlanta for a job in logistics software. A small irony I only recognized much later, and I drove up on weekends to help him furnish his first apartment from thrift stores and yard sales, both of us pretending the drive wasn't really about missing the sound of a third person in the house. I took up watercolor painting on Wednesday evenings at the community center, badly at first, and then with a patience I hadn't known I possessed. I kept teaching piano, watched a generation of nervous 8-year-olds grow into confident teenagers who no longer needed me, and told myself, honestly and without bitterness, that I had built a good, quiet, sufficient life out of what remained. I had no reason to suspect that quiet life was resting on top of something I had never been permitted to see. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning in August. I was in my garden clipping the last of the summer tomatoes when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, a Charleston area code I associated only vaguely with Marcus and Renee, people I hadn't spoken to in years beyond a brief holiday card each December. I almost let it go to voicemail. Some small and stubborn instinct, made me answer instead. Mrs. Winslow. The voice was formal, careful, a man introducing himself as a compliance officer with Anchor Trust and Savings, a private bank I had never once heard my husband mention in 34 years of marriage. I'm calling regarding an account held under the name Thomas Allen Winslow. I understand you may be the executor of his estate. I told him I was, though I felt something cold settle behind my ribs even as I said it, because Thomas had no accounts I didn't know about. I had closed every one of them myself. A decade earlier, sitting at our dining room table with a folder of death certificates and account numbers, tying off every loose thread of his financial life with the meticulous patience of a woman determined not to leave anything unfinished. Or so I had believed. There was a brief pause on the line, the kind of pause that carries more than any sentence could. "Ma'am," the officer said, and I could hear him choosing his words with unusual care, "this account has been dormant since your husband's passing in 2016. Yesterday, it received an incoming wire transfer in the amount of $47,300,000. Given that the account holder is deceased, our compliance department flagged the transaction, and I'm required to verify the account's status with the estate's representative before we can proceed." I stood very still in my garden with a half-clipped tomato vine still in my hand, and for a long moment I said nothing at all because there was nothing in my mind capable of forming a sentence. $47 million. An account I had never known existed. A husband who had been dead for 10 years, somehow still receiving money as though he had simply stepped out of the room. There must be some mistake. I finally managed, though even as I said it, some small, distant part of me was already running back through every unanswered question I had quietly set aside over the years without ever letting myself examine too closely. The way Thomas had sometimes taken calls on the back porch instead of inside the house. The unmarked storage unit he'd rented for years and never once let me help him organize. The evening, not long before he died, when I'd found him standing very still at the kitchen window, staring out at nothing, and he had only said he was tired, and I had believed him, because I had no reason then to believe anything else. "I understand this is a shock, ma'am," he said gently. "I'd recommend you come into the branch with your husband's death certificate and letters of administration, so we can walk through the account history together. There is quite a lot to explain." I do not remember hanging up the phone. I remember standing in the garden for what must have been 20 minutes, the tomato vine still dangling from my fingers, watching a mockingbird work its way along the fence line as though the entire world had not just tilted sideways beneath me. 10 years. 10 years of birthdays and holidays and quiet Tuesday evenings, believing I had closed every account, settled every debt, understood every corner of the man I had married. And the whole time, somewhere in a private bank I had never heard of, an account bearing his name had simply been waiting. I did not call Marcus that day, though I thought about it more than once. Some instinct, sharpened by decades of reading the small silences in other people's voices, told me to wait until I understood more before I let anyone else into what I now knew. I drove to the courthouse the following morning and requested a certified copy of my letters of administration, the legal document naming me executor of Thomas's estate, filed and closed a decade earlier. Then I drove downtown to the glass tower where Anchor Trust kept its private banking offices, a building I had passed 1,000 times without ever once imagining it held any part of my husband's life inside it. The branch manager, a composed man named Walter Higgins, met me in a small conference room with a folder already prepared, as though he had been expecting this conversation for some time. He explained, in the measured tone of a man delivering difficult news slowly on purpose, that the account had been opened in 1994, 8 years into our marriage, and funded initially with a modest deposit that Thomas had described on the paperwork as inherited capital. Over the following 2 decades, the account's balance had grown steadily through what the bank's internal notes described as periodic distributions from a private holding entity, a company called Windward Logistics Partners, in which Thomas had apparently held a significant private stake. Windward Logistics, I repeated. I had never heard the name in my life. It's a shipping and freight investment partnership, Higgins said. Fairly obscure, privately held. Your husband was listed as a founding minority partner, dating back to 1993. 93, a year before we opened that account. 2 years before our 10th wedding anniversary. The year I remembered clearly because it was the year we had almost, taken a real vacation to celebrate, before Thomas had gently talked us out of it, citing a slow season for the business and the wisdom of saving instead. The account went dormant after his death, Higgins continued, because our compliance protocols require confirmation of account holder status before any activity can occur, and no one ever came forward to update his records. Under normal circumstances, we would have escheat the funds to the state after a period of inactivity. But Windward Logistics has apparently continued making periodic distributions into it regardless, treating the account as active on their end, even though our internal flags marked it dormant. Those distributions simply accumulated quietly for 10 years, until yesterday's transfer triggered a compliance review large enough to require direct verification. I sat in that small conference room and tried to absorb what I was being told. My husband, the man who drove a truck with a rusted wheel well and wore the same ball cap for a decade, had been a founding partner in a shipping investment company since before I even knew the word existed in relation to him. And that company had continued sending him money, faithfully, for a full decade after his death, as though somewhere inside its operations, no one had ever bothered to notice, or care, that Thomas Winslow no longer walked the earth. Higgins slid a printed account summary across the table, page after page of quarterly deposits stretching back 30 years, and I found myself scanning the earliest entries the way a person searches for a familiar face in an old photograph. The very first deposit, dated November of 1994, was modest by comparison to what came later, just under $60,000, but the entries grew steadily larger through the early 2000s, then again through 2007 and 2008, years I remembered only for a kitchen renovation we had postponed twice, and a used sedan Thomas had insisted was good enough for another few years. I remember those years as lean ones. The numbers on the page in front of me told a very different story. Who runs Windward Logistics now? I asked, though some cold, still part of me already suspected the answer before Higgins spoke it. He turned a page in his folder. The managing partner listed on our most recent correspondence, he said, is a Mr. Marcus Doyle. I felt the floor of the last decade quietly rearrange itself beneath me. I drove home that afternoon with the windows down, the marsh air thick with salt and heat, and I did not cry, which surprised me the way it always surprises a person when grief refuses to behave the way you expect it to. I stood in the driveway for a long while before I ever went inside, watching the porch light flicker on in the dusk the way it had every evening for 34 years, and I found myself thinking, absurdly, of how ordinary that light looked against everything I now understood to be true. I had cried for a full year after Thomas died. I had cried over his reading glasses left on the nightstand, over the smell of his flannel shirts, over a voicemail I kept for months just to hear him say my name one more time. But this was different. This was colder, and it moved through me with a strange, deliberate precision, the way ice forms along the edge of a pond before you notice the whole surface has changed. Marcus, my husband's half-brother, the man who had held my hand in my kitchen the week Thomas died and told me, over and over, that I only had to ask if I needed anything. He had known. He had to have known. You do not become the managing partner of a company your half-brother secretly co-founded without knowing exactly what that company was doing with his money for the last 10 years. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the same one I had once used to plan piano recitals and grocery lists, and I began, methodically, to reconstruct 34 years of marriage against what I now understood to be true. I thought about the vacations we never took, the modest wedding we'd planned on a schoolteacher's salary and a distributor's thin margins, the year I picked up extra piano students on weekends to help cover a roof repair that Thomas had called tight timing financially. I thought about the small, constant frugality that had defined our entire life together, a frugality I had always respected as responsible, even virtuous. I had never once resented it. I had believed, completely, that it was simply who we were. And Thomas, my Thomas, the man whose coffee I made every morning for 3 decades, had apparently been a founding partner in a company wealthy enough to distribute tens of millions of dollars, and had chosen, deliberately and consistently, never to tell me. I did not sleep much that night. In the morning, I called the number for a probate attorney a friend from church had once mentioned in passing, a woman named Foster Langley who specialized, according to her website, in complicated estates and asset recovery. I did not call Marcus. I did not call Renee. I wrote his name at the bottom of my legal pad and underlined it twice, and then I closed the notebook and drove downtown to make an appointment I intended to keep quiet for as long as I possibly could. Foster Langley's office sat on the 4th floor of a converted cotton warehouse near the river, all exposed brick and tall windows that looked out over the water where Thomas used to work. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, with the kind of unhurried attentiveness that made me trust her within the first 5 minutes. I told her everything. The phone call, the dormant account, Windward Logistics, Marcus's name on the most recent correspondence. She took notes in careful shorthand and asked precise questions. Whether Thomas had ever filed separate tax returns, whether I recalled signing any documents I hadn't fully read, whether we had a prenuptial agreement. We did not. Here's where we likely stand, she said finally, setting down her pen. Georgia treats assets acquired during a marriage as generally subject to equitable distribution and estate claims, even when one spouse held them without the other's knowledge. Because this account was opened in 1994, well after your wedding, and because Windward Logistics appears to have been founded in 1993, also during your marriage, the presumption favors you as the surviving spouse and estate beneficiary. The larger question, she tapped the folder in front of her, is what exactly Windward Logistics is, how it's been operated for the last decade, and what role Marcus Doyle has played in keeping this account concealed from you. If he's been running it since Thomas died, I said slowly, he's had 10 years to hide whatever he wanted hidden. Then we need records before he has any more time to arrange them, Langley said. I'll file a formal request for Thomas's ownership documentation, tax filings connected to the partnership, and any correspondence between him and Marcus. If Marcus has been managing this without disclosing your husband's death to his own partners, or without disclosing the account to you, that alone raises serious questions. I signed a retainer agreement that afternoon and walked out of that converted cotton warehouse into the thick savanna heat feeling, for the first time in 10 years, that the ground beneath me had a shape I could actually navigate. I did not yet know how very far that ground would still need to stretch. I only knew, standing there, that I was no longer willing to stand still. Marcus called me that same evening, and the timing, I would later understand, was not a coincidence at all. He was warm, solicitous, asking how I was holding up, whether I'd been getting enough rest, whether Renee could bring over a casserole like the old days. It was only near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, that he mentioned he'd heard some kind of banking mix-up had come up regarding Thomas's old accounts, and that he'd be happy to help sort through anything confusing. "I've already retained an attorney," I said, keeping my voice mild. "But thank you, Marcus." There was a pause on the line, brief but unmistakable, the sound of a man recalculating in real time. "Oh," he said. "Of course. Anyone I'd know." "Someone local," I said. "Very thorough." I did not give him Foster Langley's name. We spoke for a few more minutes about nothing in particular, the weather in Charleston, Renee's garden club, and when I finally hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time thinking about the exact texture of that pause. Marcus had always been a careful man, skilled at controlling his reactions in front of an audience. But a decade of managing a concealed fortune, I suspected, had made him careless in ways he didn't yet realize. The documents Langley requested through formal channels arrived 6 weeks later, delivered in 3 thick binders that told a story far more complicated than either of us had anticipated. Windward Logistics Partners, it turned out, had been founded in 1993 as a small freight forwarding operation connecting Savannah's port to inland distribution networks. Thomas had invested an inheritance from his mother's estate, a modest sum at the time, in exchange for a founding 38% ownership stake, structured as a silent partnership with full profit distribution rights but no public role in day-to-day management. Marcus, 5 years younger and eager to build something of his own, had taken the operational lead, expanding the company through the early 2000s into container shipping and eventually international freight brokerage, a business that had grown, by the time of Thomas's death, into a genuinely lucrative enterprise worth tens of millions of dollars. Every filing was legitimate. Every tax return had been submitted correctly under the partnership's corporate structure. Thomas had not evaded a single dollar in taxes, had not laundered a cent, had cut no illegal corners across 3 decades of quiet, patient accumulation, and had done nothing that would have interested a single federal investigator. He had simply, deliberately, never told his wife that he owned more than a third of a company worth of fortune, and had structured his own compensation, quietly, modestly, in a way that let him keep driving a truck with a rusted wheel well and complaining about thin margins for over 20 years. Reading through the earliest partnership records, I learned that Thomas had used part of his mother's inheritance not because Windward Logistics had approached him, but because he had approached Marcus first, in the winter of 1993, with an idea about connecting small independent shrimping outfits to a more reliable freight network along the coast. It had been Thomas's instinct, Thomas's initial capital, and Thomas's early relationships with dock workers and boat captains that gave the company its first real customers, even though Marcus's name was the one that ended up on every public filing and every piece of company letterhead in the years that followed. Somewhere in the shaping of that arrangement, the two brothers had apparently settled into roles that suited each of them, Marcus as the visible face of a growing company, Thomas as a silent, comfortable presence content to watch it grow from a distance, never imagining, perhaps, quite how far it would eventually grow, or quite how long he would choose to keep it hidden. "This is good news, in a sense," Langley said carefully, watching my face as I turned through the documents at our conference table. "The estate is fully claimable. There's no federal entanglement, no criminal exposure on Thomas's side." "Is it good news?" I asked. "That my husband spent 22 years lying to me about what our life could have been?" She didn't answer that, because there was no good answer to give. Instead, she slid a single page across the table, a partnership amendment filed in 2011, 5 years before Thomas died, that I had never seen before in my life. It stated, in plain and unambiguous legal language, that upon Thomas Allen Winslow's death, his full ownership stake in Windward Logistics Partners would transfer, in its entirety, to his lawful spouse, Eleanor Marie Winslow, with no conditions, no exceptions, and no role for any other party in that transfer. "He knew he wanted this to come to you," Langley said quietly. Whatever else he was doing, he made sure of that at least. I looked at that document for a long time. It should have felt like a comfort, some small proof that beneath all the concealment, Thomas had still meant, eventually, for the truth to reach me. Instead, it only sharpened the question that had been sitting in my chest for 6 weeks. If he had intended for me to inherit this all along, why had he spent his entire adult life making certain I never once suspected it existed? And Marcus? I asked. Was he aware of this amendment? Langley paused for a moment, letting the weight of the amendment settle fully in the quiet office before turning to the next page, a distribution list attached to the same 2011 filing, showing every partner who had received a copy at the time it was executed. Marcus Doyle's name sat second on the list, directly beneath Thomas's own. He had known for 15 years exactly where that money was supposed to go, and for the 10 years since Thomas's death, he had quietly kept sending it into a dormant account instead of ever once picking up the phone to tell me it existed. Langley brought in a forensic accountant that same week, a soft-spoken man named Curtis Abel who had spent 20 years untangling exactly this kind of quiet, patient concealment for estates across the Southeast. He worked through Windward Logistics filings line by line, cross-referencing every distribution against the company's own internal ledgers, and what he found only sharpened the picture already forming in my mind. The distributions into Thomas's dormant account had never actually stopped after his death. Not once, not for a single quarter in 10 years. They had simply been rerouted internally, held in a suspense account rather than the dormant one, and released only now, all at once, because a new regulatory reporting requirement had forced Windward Logistics to reconcile every partner's holdings against verified, active accounts before the fiscal year closed. In other words, Marcus had not stumbled into an oversight. He had built a structure specifically designed to keep that money moving quietly around me for a decade, and it was only a compliance deadline, not conscience, that had finally forced it back into the light. I drove down to the old docks one evening that week, to the stretch of the Savannah River where Thomas used to check moorings for extra cash on weekends, or so I had always believed. The shrimp boats were mostly gone now, replaced by pleasure craft and a handful of tour operators, but the smell of the water was the same, brine and diesel and the particular mineral coolness of a tidal river at dusk. I stood there for a long time, trying to picture the version of my husband who had once signed papers making him a founding partner in a shipping empire, and I found I couldn't quite do it. That man and the man who came home smelling of the docks every evening, tired and quiet and grateful for a plate of supper, seemed to belong to two entirely separate lives, and I understood, standing there in the fading light, that I had only ever been permitted to know one of them. The probate filing went in on a Thursday in late September, 10 years almost to the week since Thomas had died out on the water alone. Langley moved with the efficiency of a woman who understood that speed itself was a form of leverage, filing the estate claim, the amendment, and a formal notice to Windward Logistics before Marcus had any real opportunity to prepare a defense of his own. The dormant account was formally identified as part of Thomas's estate. The full ownership documentation was submitted to the court, and somewhere in Charleston, I imagined, a phone was ringing that Marcus had spent 10 years hoping he'd never have to answer. He called 4 days later, and this time there was no warmth left in his voice at all. "Nora," he said, "we need to talk about what's actually fair here." "I'm listening," I said. "Thomas's stake was never meant to just sit there," he said. "I've been running this company for 10 years, building it, growing it, while that account collected dust because nobody knew it existed. Do you understand how much work that's been? I kept his ownership on the books out of loyalty, out of respect for my brother, and now you want to walk in and take the whole thing without acknowledging any of that. You knew about the 2011 amendment," I said quietly. "You've known for 15 years exactly where that ownership was supposed to go." There was a silence on the line, the kind that confirms more than any words could. I think we should discuss a settlement, he said finally, his voice tightening into something harder. A number that reflects everything I've contributed to this business over the last decade. Otherwise, this is going to get expensive and public for both of us, and there are things about how Thomas structured certain accounts that I don't think you want examined too closely. It was a threat wrapped carefully inside a business conversation, the implication that some hidden complication might surface if I pushed too hard, though I noticed, even in that moment, that he never specified what it might be. I had spent 34 years reading the careful silences of people who chose their words with precision, and I recognized this one immediately for what it was: a man bluffing from a position that had already begun to crumble beneath him. "Send whatever offer you'd like through my attorney," I said. "But Marcus, I want to be clear about something. I am not walking away from this." I hung up before he could answer. My hands, I noticed, were shaking slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the particular tremble that arrives after your body has held itself rigid through a difficult conversation and is finally permitted to release. The settlement letter arrived 9 days later, forwarded through Langley's office from a Charleston law firm called Ashwood & Kerr. It proposed that I release all claims against Windward Logistics Partners and the accumulated distributions in exchange for a lump sum of $8 million, framed generously in the letter's language as a fair resolution honoring the complicated history between the families. The letter used the word family 4 times in 3 paragraphs, which told me everything I needed to know about how confident, or how nervous, its authors actually were. "They're testing you," Langley said, watching my face as I read it at her conference table. $8 million out of a stake worth, what, 60, 70 million by now with 10 years of growth. I asked. "Closer to 74, based on the distribution history," she said. "The number is low enough to suggest they're hoping you'll take a figure with 7 zeros and consider yourself fortunate rather than risk a longer fight." "Send a formal rejection," I said. "No counteroffer. I don't want them thinking there's a number that would satisfy me." "That will escalate things," Langley warned. "Let it," I said. I had lunch with my closest friend, Barbara Coyle, the following week at a small cafe near the river where we'd been meeting for coffee since our own children were small. I told her everything: the account, the amendment, Marcus's call, the settlement letter, and Barbara, who had never in 20 years learned to interrupt a story before it was finished, listened without a single word until I ran out of things to say. "How are you actually doing?" she asked finally, underneath all the legal strategy. "Angry," I admitted, "and grieving something I didn't even know I'd lost until 6 weeks ago. I keep thinking about the trip to the Amalfi Coast we never took. We postponed it 3 times because money was tight, Barbara." "Money was never tight." "You trusted your husband," Barbara said, with the plain directness I had always loved in her, the same directness she had carried through every hard conversation we'd shared since our children were young. "That isn't a failure on your part. That's what a marriage is supposed to let a person do." We sat with that for a while, the river moving slowly past the cafe windows, and before we parted, Barbara said something I found myself returning to again and again in the weeks that followed. "Thomas made his choices in secret," she said. "Everything you do from here forward, you're doing in the open. That's the whole difference between the 2 of you." Marcus and Renee showed up at my house without calling, on a Saturday evening in late October, the light already thinning early into autumn across the marsh. Renee was carrying a bottle of wine, an expensive one, the kind of gesture designed to say we are equals here, we are being generous. The last time she had visited my house, 10 years earlier, she had brought a grocery store casserole and sat beside me holding my hand. The wine, I understood immediately, was a different kind of message entirely. "We were driving through and thought we'd stop by," Renee said, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. I let them in, because refusing would have told them something about my own uncertainty that I wasn't willing to reveal. We sat in my living room, the same room where they had once offered condolences I had believed completely, and I set out water instead of wine glasses, a small detail Marcus registered without comment. "Nora," he began, his voice pitched low and reasonable, "I need you to understand something about how this business actually works. Thomas's stake generated returns because of decisions I made, risks I took, years I spent building relationships he never had to manage. If you take the whole thing, you're not just taking what Thomas owned. You're taking credit for work that was mine. The 2011 amendment doesn't mention your work," I said. "It mentions Thomas's stake and where it was legally required to go." Something shifted behind his composed expression, the reasonable tone pulling back just slightly to reveal what had been sitting underneath it. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said. "There are other investors in this partnership who won't take kindly to a public estate battle dragging our finances through a courtroom. There are things that could come out about how certain distributions were structured over the years that wouldn't reflect well on anyone, including Thomas." There it was again, the same vague threat he'd offered on the phone weeks earlier, a suggestion of hidden complications he never quite named, designed to land precisely in the place where my uncertainty still lived. I had spent 34 years married to a man who chose his words with exquisite care, and I recognized, watching Marcus now, the particular strain of a person improvising confidence he no longer fully possessed. "Marcus," I said, "I've read the amendment. I've read the distribution list with your name on it. Whatever you're implying might come out. I think we both know it already has." The room went very quiet. Renee's smile finally faltered completely. Marcus stood, using his height the way certain men do, as a kind of unspoken statement, and told me I was making a serious mistake, one that would cost me far more than I understood. Perhaps I was, I told him, but it was mine to make. They left without finishing their water. I watched Renee's car back out of my driveway faster than necessary, and then I closed the door, locked it, and stood in my hallway with my back against the wood, breathing, while my hands finally allowed themselves to shake. I called Langley that night and reported everything Marcus had said in careful, precise detail, exactly the way I had once transcribed piano lessons for students who needed to hear a phrase repeated to understand it. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived, this one less polished than the first, written in a tone that had abandoned any pretense of family harmony. It suggested, without stating outright, that Windward Logistics investors might find it necessary to launch their own review of Thomas's original 1993 investment, implying, however faintly, that questions could be raised about how a young marine parts supplier had come to possess enough capital to buy into a founding partnership in the first place. It was a clumsy attempt at intimidation, and Langley recognized it as one immediately. "They're not building a case," she told me over the phone. "They're hoping the suggestion alone frightens you into a settlement before discovery starts in earnest." I asked her to respond the same way we had responded to the first letter, with nothing at all beyond a formal rejection, and she did. I heard nothing further from Ashwood and Kerr for 11 weeks after that, a silence I came to understand, once the hearing was underway, as the sound of a legal strategy quietly running out of road. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in January, 16 months after that first phone call in my garden, 10 years and 4 months since Thomas had died on the water alone. I woke before my alarm that morning, showered, and dressed in a navy blazer I had bought specifically for the occasion, not because I believed clothing determined anything, but because I had learned over the previous months that preparation was its own quiet form of armor. I drank my coffee at the same kitchen table where I had once made grocery lists, now filled with a different kind of writing entirely, and drove to the Chatham County Courthouse beneath a cold, clear winter sky. The probate courtroom was smaller than I had expected, wood-paneled and fluorescent lit, carrying the particular smell of old paper and municipal carpet that I remembered faintly from jury duty decades earlier. Judge Renata Castillo presided, a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an expression of careful, unhurried patience. Marcus was already seated at the opposing table when I arrived, flanked by 2 attorneys from Ashwood and Kerr, having flown in the previous evening. He did not look at me as I entered, speaking quietly instead to his lead counsel, a compact, silver-haired man named Prescott. Renee sat in the gallery in dark clothing, her expression unreadable. Langley presented our case with the steady thoroughness of a woman who had spent 4 months building something airtight. The 1993 founding of Windward Logistics during our marriage, the 2011 amendment naming me as sole beneficiary of Thomas's stake, the full and clean tax history, the decade of household records that showed a lifestyle entirely inconsistent with a man who secretly owned a third of a multi-million-dollar shipping company. The argument was simple and devastating in its clarity. Thomas Winslow had concealed a substantial marital asset from his wife for over 2 decades, had formally directed that asset to pass to her upon his death, and Marcus Doyle, aware of that directive since 2011, had continued withholding it for 10 additional years after Thomas's passing. Prescott's response was polished but thinner than Marcus's confidence in my living room had suggested it would be. He argued that Marcus had made the business what it was, that operational contributions deserved compensation independent of the original ownership structure, and that any distributions withheld had simply reflected an informal, ongoing understanding between the brothers about how the company's growth should be managed. "Your Honor," Prescott said, "Mr. Doyle has served as the sole active steward of this partnership for over 3 decades, including the 10 years since Mr. Winslow's death, during which he continued the account's growth in good faith, believing the matter of formal transfer would eventually be settled between the families." It was the same mistake Langley had warned me to watch for, buried in that single sentence. In order to justify Marcus's competing claim, Prescott had needed to argue that his client had continuous knowledge of Thomas's ownership and its intended disposition throughout the entire 10 years since Thomas's death, which meant the filing had just formally confirmed, on the record, that Marcus had known precisely where that fortune was supposed to go the entire time he was quietly keeping it from me. Langley rose immediately. "Your Honor, I'd like to draw the court's attention to what opposing counsel has just established on behalf of his own client." She read the relevant portion of the filing aloud, without embellishment, letting the words carry their own weight. By Mr. Prescott's own argument, Mr. Doyle has had continuous knowledge for at least 10 years that his brother's estate, including a legally binding 2011 amendment naming Mrs. Winslow as sole beneficiary, was never transferred to her. He did not disclose this to her when she called him the week her husband died. He did not disclose it in any of the following 10 years. He disclosed it only after being compelled to respond to a formal estate claim. She paused, then produced a final document, one that Langley's forensic accountant had located only that week, buried in an old email server Windward Logistics had migrated years earlier and never fully purged. It was a message from Marcus to Thomas, dated in the spring of 2009, discussing the pending amendment and explicitly requesting that it stay between the 2 of us for now. No need to complicate things with Nora. Mr. Doyle was not merely aware of this arrangement, Langley said. He actively requested that his brother keep it concealed from his own wife 15 years before this hearing, and then continued that concealment unilaterally for a full decade after Mr. Winslow's death. The courtroom went very still. I watched something in Marcus's posture give way, the composure he had carried into the room finally cracking at its edges. He turned toward Prescott and said something low and urgent that I couldn't fully hear, though the word email reached me clearly enough, along with the unmistakable tone of a man realizing in real time exactly how much ground had just shifted beneath him. Judge Castillo removed her reading glasses and studied both tables for a long moment. "I'm going to call a 15-minute recess," she said, "after which I will hear final arguments on the question of Mr. Doyle's standing in light of what has just been entered into the record." She looked directly at Prescott. "Counsel, I'd suggest you use the time to speak with your client about the implications of what was just read into this court." During the recess, I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Langley, and she told me quietly that whatever happened next, the record itself had already done most of the work we needed. I thought about Curtis Abel's ledgers, about the suspense account Marcus had built to keep the money moving invisibly for a decade, about the heron I sometimes watched from my kitchen window on ordinary mornings when none of this seemed real. I did not feel triumphant sitting on that hallway bench. I felt, more than anything, like a woman finally being handed the last page of a book she had been reading for 10 years without ever knowing the ending. When the court reconvened, the energy at the opposing table had shifted entirely. Prescott's closing arguments were noticeably less confident, careful now in a way that suggested a hurried, difficult conversation had occurred behind closed doors during the recess. Judge Castillo listened with the same unhurried patience she had shown all morning, asked several precise questions about the 2009 email and its authenticity, and then removed her glasses one final time. "The court has reviewed the competing claim filed on behalf of Marcus Doyle," she said, "and has now heard argument from both parties, along with documentary evidence establishing that Mr. Doyle possessed direct knowledge, since at least 2009, of a legally binding amendment directing his brother's ownership stake to pass to Mrs. Winslow upon his death. Mr. Doyle did not disclose this amendment to Mrs. Winslow at any point during the 10 years following her husband's death, despite regular contact between the parties, and despite his own continued management of the distributions in question." Her voice carried the particular finality of words becoming permanent record. "The competing claim is dismissed. The full estate of Thomas Allen Winslow, including all holdings connected to Windward Logistics Partners and the associated account at Anchor Trust and Savings, is confirmed as the sole property of Eleanor Marie Winslow as surviving spouse and named beneficiary. Additionally, this court will be referring the matter of Mr. Doyle's decade-long concealment of a known estate obligation to the office of the district attorney for review." She paused, and her expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Winslow, this court is sorry for your loss, and for everything it took you 10 years to learn. The estate is yours." Renee, in the gallery, had gone very still, her carefully composed presence finally slipping to reveal something raw underneath it, the expression of a woman recalculating in real time everything she had assumed her future would hold. Prescott did not look at his client as the ruling was read. He simply closed his folder, slowly, the way a person closes a book they already know how the story ends. The gavel came down once, quietly, and the room began to move around me. I did not look at Marcus or Renee. I thought instead about Thomas, about the ball cap he wore for a decade, about the amendment he had signed in 2011, making certain, in his own quiet way, that eventually this would reach me, even if he never found the courage to tell me himself while he was alive. I had not come to that courtroom for revenge. I had come because the alternative was to let a decade of silence simply stand, unquestioned, as the whole truth of my own life. Outside on the courthouse steps, Langley shook my hand. "You didn't say much in there," she said. "But you didn't need to. That's exactly the point." I drove home along streets that looked precisely as they had that morning, past the marsh grass and the low-hanging oaks, and sat for a long moment in my driveway before going inside. Then I called my son, Peter, in Atlanta, and told him it was finally over. "Mom," he said, after a long silence, "what happens now?" I looked out at the garden where I had been standing when the whole story began, at the fence line where a heron sometimes landed in the early mornings, and I told him the only true answer I had. "Now," I said quietly, "I finally get to find out who I really am, on the other side of everything your father never once told me." I went to Portugal that spring, not the modest week-long trip Thomas and I had endlessly postponed, but a full month, a small rented house above the cliffs near Lagos with white stone walls and a view of the Atlantic that seemed to stretch farther than memory itself. I paid off the last of Peter's mortgage in a single transfer and listened to him go quiet on the phone in a way that told me everything words couldn't. I established a scholarship fund at the small academy where I taught piano for 30 years, named simply for a student, not for Thomas, because some legacies deserve to belong to someone still building a future rather than someone who spent his whole life hiding one. I renovated the kitchen I had wanted for decades and left the cracked porch step exactly as it was, a small, deliberate reminder of the life I had actually lived before any of this began. Barbara came to visit me in Portugal for a week that summer, and over dinner on a terrace overlooking the water, she looked at me across the table and said I looked like myself, possibly for the first time in years. I told her I thought that might be true. Peter flew out for the last few days of that trip, and the two of us spent a whole afternoon walking the cliffs above Lagos in near silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have already said the important things and no longer need to repeat them. He told me, near the end of that walk, that he sometimes still thought about the years he'd apologized to himself for needing student loans, for feeling like a burden on a household that could barely stretch to cover a roof repair. I told him the same thing I had been telling myself, slowly for months. None of that had ever been his fault, or mine. It had simply been the shape of a life built on a secret neither of us had known to look for. Marcus was indicted on charges related to fraudulent concealment of estate assets 3 months after the hearing, and the legal costs of his defense, combined with the loss of his managing position at Windward Logistics, consumed far more of his own finances than the modest settlement he had once offered me. Renee's social circle in Charleston, built largely on the appearance of a comfortable life, dissolved quietly once that comfort no longer existed to sustain it. I did not attend Marcus's trial when it was finally scheduled the following spring. Some stories, I had come to understand, do not require a witness for their ending to matter. I still think, sometimes, about the version of Thomas the First spent 34 years believing I knew completely, the man in the ball cap who came home smelling of the docks, tired and grateful for a plate of supper. I no longer try to reconcile him fully with the quiet, calculating partner who signed a founding stake in 1993 and never once mentioned it. Not on our anniversaries, not on the nights we sat at the kitchen table doing careful math on a budget that never needed to be so careful at all. I have simply come to hold both versions of him at once, the way you learn to hold two true things that never quite agree with each other. He loved me, I believe that completely, and he also, for reasons I will never fully understand, decided that love and honesty did not have to travel together. I have chosen, for my own sake, to let that be his contradiction to Carrie and not mine. I converted Thomas's old workshop behind the house into a proper studio that spring, with better light for painting and a wall of windows facing the marsh, and some mornings I sit out there with a cup of coffee before I ever pick up a brush, simply watching the tide move in across the grass the way it has for longer than any of us. Peter visits most months now, driving down from Atlanta with his fiancée, a soft-spoken architect named Josie who has never once asked me about the money, only about the garden, which I have come to appreciate more than she probably realizes. I came home from Portugal on a bright morning in June, made coffee in my new kitchen, and stood at the window looking out at a garden that had, somehow, held the entire truth of my life quietly beneath its soil for 10 years before I ever thought to look. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Kate's Fortune Stories for more true-to-life tales of resilience, discovery, and the courage it takes to reclaim what's rightfully yours. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, and I'll see you in the next story.